Somewhere in a kitchen almost exactly like yours, there's a cabinet where the good dishes and the genuinely worthless ones are sitting stacked right on top of each other, and nobody in the house could tell you which is which just by looking. I went through every kind of old dish I could find real sold prices for and ranked every single one, starting with the pieces that are truly worth nothing, all the way up to the ones that have quietly sold for a small fortune. Some of what lands at the very bottom of this list is probably sitting in your cabinet right now. So is some of what lands at the very top, and by the end you'll know exactly which end of that shelf you should be checking first. At the very bottom, honestly, sits most of what people assume is special simply because it's old. A plain set of modern dinnerware from the last few decades, nothing hand-painted, no maker anyone collects, just ordinary daily dishes, sells for next to nothing even in perfect condition. Age alone never bought anyone anything. If a piece has no pattern name, no distinctive maker, and nothing unusual about its shape, it's almost certainly sitting at the bottom of this list, along with everything else nobody's ever bid on. Just above that sits the pattern. Almost every household from the 1970s and 1980s actually has a piece of somewhere. Corel's butterfly gold, that cream-colored plate with the yellow flower pattern, was one of the best-selling dinnerware patterns ever made in this country. And that success is exactly why a single plate still only sells for a few dollars. The lightweight, almost unbreakable glass it's made from was genuinely innovative when it launched, but decades of production means the supply never really tightened. A full, complete set with the original box, and no chips climbs a little higher than loose pieces. But this pattern was made to survive, and so much of it did, that scarcity was never really on the table. Right around that same level sits Currier and Ives Blue, the mid-century pattern with the old-fashioned winter scenes printed in dark blue on white. Made by Royal China, starting in the 1950s, and sold for decades afterward, at grocery stores and gas stations as a promotional giveaway. Individual plates typically sell for $5 to $25. It sits low on this list for the same reason butterfly gold does. It was everywhere, on purpose, and dishes designed to be given away by the thousands rarely turn into anything rare later. Pfaltzgraf's Yorktown pattern sits in that same neighborhood, the brown speckled stoneware with the folk art tulip design that's been sold continuously since the 1960s. Because it never really stopped being produced, common pieces sell for about the same as Currier and Ives, $5 to $20 each. The exception is the earliest pieces from before the company switched factories in the 1980s, which carry a slightly different glaze finish and a different backstamp. And those early examples in larger serving forms occasionally bring $30 to $60 from collectors who specifically want the original run rather than the version still sold today. Ahead of that sits Hall China's Autumn Leaf, the orange and gold fall-colored pattern that hung in kitchens across the Midwest for generations. Unlike the previous two, this one was sold specifically through a tea and coffee company as a loyalty reward, which limited how it was distributed even while millions of pieces still went out. Common plates and cups run $20 to $50, but the harder-to-find serving pieces, a covered casserole, a teapot, a rare early shape, can climb toward $100 or more, especially with the lid or handle still intact and undamaged. The earliest pieces from the 1930s and 40s used a slightly different, more saturated glaze than the later decades of production, and collectors who know to compare the exact shade of orange against a reference photo can often date a piece within a decade just from the color alone, without ever needing to find a mark. Moving up again, Franciscan's Desert Rose, instantly recognizable by its pink rose and green leaf pattern on a cream background. It became one of the best-selling American dinnerware lines of the 20th century, so most everyday plates and bowls still only bring $20 to $50 for exactly the reason you'd expect. But the harder serving forms, a gravy boat, a covered vegetable dish, certain sizes of platter, regularly sell for $50 to $150 because a company that sold millions of dinner plates didn't make nearly as many of the specialty pieces to go with them. Right around that same tier sits something genuinely different, hand-painted Blue Ridge pottery from a company called Southern Potteries, made in Tennessee, mostly between the 1930s and 1950s. Unlike everything ranked so far, each piece was painted by hand rather than printed by machine, which means no two plates in the same pattern look perfectly identical. Common patterns sell for $10 to $30 a plate, similar to everything else in this tier, but the rarer, more elaborate hand-painted patterns and complete matching sets in excellent condition have sold for well over $100. The test here is simple. Run your finger across the pattern and feel for the slight texture of real brushwork instead of a perfectly smooth printed surface. Johnson Brothers' Friendly Village belongs in this same tier too, the English ironstone pattern with small painted village scenes, a mill, a covered bridge, a horse-drawn cart that shows up in more American china cabinets than most people realize. It was imported and sold widely from the 1950s onward, so common plates and cups run $10 to $30, right alongside Blue Ridge and Franciscan. What separates a better piece here is completeness and the specific scene. Certain harder-to-find serving pieces, a covered vegetable dish, or a large platter with a less common village scene, have sold for $60 to $100, especially with the back stamp still crisp and legible rather than worn smooth from decades of washing. From here, the jump gets bigger, and it's worth pausing on why before we go further. Everything ranked so far climbed for the same three reasons: how widely it was originally distributed, how many collectors are actively chasing that specific form or color today, and whether it survived complete instead of chipped, cracked, or missing its lid. Keep those three things in mind, because the rest of this list is about to make that difference very obvious. Fiestaware is where this whole ranking changes shape, because unlike everything mentioned so far, it isn't one pattern, it's a whole spectrum hiding inside a single brand. Homer Laughlin's solid-colored Fiesta line launched in 1936, and it's genuinely one of the most collected American dinnerware lines that exists. A common plate in yellow, turquoise, or cobalt blue, the colors that were made for decades, typically sells for $20 to $100, depending on the exact piece. Genuine vintage pieces from the original run usually carry an impressed mark reading Genuine Fiesta stamped right into the clay, and larger pieces almost always carry it, while smaller items sometimes only show a small mold number instead. That's already a real jump from everything ranked before it, and we haven't even gotten to the colors that actually matter. The color is what decides everything from here. Certain later colors like chartreuse, rose, gray, and forest green were only produced for a handful of years in the 1950s, and pieces in those shades commonly sell for $50 to $350, several times what the same exact plate would bring in a common color. But one color sits above all the others by a wide margin, and it's not even the color most people assume is the rare one. Medium green, made for only about 10 years starting in 1959, is considered the single rarest color in the entire original line. Even a small bread and butter plate in medium green can bring $45 to $250. That's the smallest, least dramatic form you can find it in, and there's essentially no size or form in that color that isn't worth setting aside rather than donating. Near the very top sits the original red, and this one comes with a strange piece of history attached. Fiesta's first run of red, produced only from 1936 to 1944, got its vivid orange-red color from uranium oxide mixed into the glaze, and production stopped entirely during the war when the government seized the material. Certain early forms made only in that short pre-war window, a covered marmalade jar, a demitasse coffee pot, a tripod candle holder, have sold for $400 to $600 each, simply because they were pulled from production before most people ever got the chance to buy one. And then there's the tier that actually earns the word fortune, the rare forms that collectors chase regardless of which color they happen to find them in. A Fiesta disc water pitcher has sold for $450 to $1,100. A covered onion soup bowl, one of the hardest shapes to find in any color, has brought $600 to $1,500. A tall Fiesta vase in an early original color has sold for as much as $2,500, and a rare striped Fiesta chop plate from the 1930s, blue, green, or red stripes over ivory, sold for $1,275 on its own. Every one of those started life as an ordinary piece of dinnerware, sitting on someone's table, the same way any of yours have. What ties the entire bottom of this list to the very top is never really age, and it's never really how the piece looks sitting on a shelf. It comes down to three things every single time: how widely it was originally made and sold, how many collectors are actively hunting the exact form or color you're holding, and whether it survived complete, undamaged, and unchipped after decades of actual daily use. Nothing on this list climbed simply because it got older sitting in a cupboard. It climbed because of what happened, or didn't happen, to it during a short window decades ago. The plainest, most familiar pattern in your cabinet might be sitting at the very bottom of everything I just walked through, worth exactly what it looks like. Or it might be one color, one shape, one lucky year away from the top. So before anything leaves your kitchen in a donation box, go pull every old dish out of that cabinet and actually check it against what you just heard. Read the pattern, check the color, look for a shape you don't recognize as ordinary. Tell me down in the comments where your own dishes landed on this list, because I have a feeling some of you are about to walk straight into your kitchen the second this video ends. And if you're not subscribed yet, hit that button and turn on notifications, because there's another one of these coming soon, ranking something else you've probably got sitting in your house right now.